The dinner was Margaret's idea. She'd mentioned it the week before, standing at the kitchen sink, not quite looking at me. Mom and Dad want us to come Sunday, a real sit-down dinner. She said it the way people say things they already know the answer to, but ask anyway. I told her sure. I told her that was fine. I drove us over in my truck, a 2009 F-150 with a dent above the rear wheel, that I kept meaning to fix. Margaret had stopped commenting on the truck years ago. Her parents never did. Her father, Gerald, met us at the door in slacks and a pressed shirt like it was a business meeting. Her mother, Sylvia, air-kissed Margaret and gave me that particular smile, the one that arrived at the lips but didn't go any further. We went inside. The dining room smelled like roast and money, the way their house always did. Gerald had built his company, Hargrove Logistics, from a regional freight broker into something with 12 distribution centers and contracts with 3 of the biggest retailers in the country. He was proud of it, the way some men are proud of their height. It wasn't something he'd done. It was something he was. I sat down at the table, and Gerald poured the wine, and the conversation moved the way it always moved in that house. Around me, never quite including me the way water moves around a rock it doesn't think is worth going over. "How's the consulting work, Walter?" he asked. He always said consulting work with a slight pause before the second word, just long enough to make it sound like something he'd had to think about calling it. "Steady?" I said. He nodded and moved on. Sylvia asked Margaret about her sister's upcoming vacation. The roast was served. The crystal caught the light from the chandelier above us, throwing small prisms across the tablecloth. I was 63 years old sitting at that table, and I had heard some version of that same conversation probably 40 times in the past 18 years. I sat there and I thought about a Tuesday morning in March, about 11 years earlier, when a man named Curtis Bright, a fund manager out of Charlotte, had called me and told me that the secondary offering was going through and my position in Hargrove Logistics had just cleared $340 million in market value. I had been eating toast when he called. I finished the toast before I said anything. Gerald did not know about any of that. Margaret did not know. Nobody at that table knew. And I had spent 11 years deciding whether that was the right choice, and I still wasn't sure. I grew up in Dayton, Ohio, the son of a man who repaired HVAC units and a woman who kept the books for a dental practice. We were comfortable. Not wealthy, comfortable. My father had a word for people who confuse those two things. It wasn't a polite word. I went to Ohio State on a partial scholarship and studied electrical engineering. After graduation, I spent 8 years working for a defense contractor outside of Columbus, doing systems work that I can't fully describe even now, not because it's classified, but because it would put you to sleep. What I can tell you is that during those 8 years, I became very good at understanding how complex systems fail, where the weak points are, how a small inefficiency compounds over time into something catastrophic. That skill turned out to be more useful outside of engineering than inside it. I left the contractor job at 31 and started doing independent consulting for logistics companies, small and mid-sized operations that were bleeding money in ways they couldn't identify. I had a gift for walking into a warehouse or a dispatch center and finding the thing that was wrong. Not the obvious thing. The thing underneath the obvious thing. Word got around. The work was good. By the time I was 38, I was earning more than my father had made in the last 20 years of his career, and I felt strange about that, in a way I never entirely resolved. I also started investing. Nothing dramatic at first. Index funds, some REIT positions, a few individual stocks in sectors I understood. I was careful. I was patient. I had watched enough companies fail from the inside to know that most investment strategies are just structured optimism, and I had a low tolerance for optimism that wasn't backed up by something real. In my mid-40s, I began taking small equity positions in some of my consulting clients. These weren't charity cases. These were companies with genuine structural problems and genuine potential, and part of my compensation became ownership stakes. Over about 15 years, 3 of those companies were acquired, 1 went public, and 1 failed entirely. The math overall was extraordinary. The kind of extraordinary that happens when you spend 20 years being right more often than you're wrong, and you let time do the rest of the work. I met Margaret at 51. She was 44, recently divorced, working as an admissions coordinator at a hospital system. She was funny and direct and had a way of listening to people that made them feel like what they were saying mattered. I fell for her before the end of our second date. I told her that, eventually. She told me she already knew. She knew I consulted. She knew I had some investment income. She knew I was comfortable. She did not know the number, and I did not tell her. That was my decision, and I've turned it over in my mind more times than I can count. Part of it was experience. I had watched money change relationships in ways that were hard to come back from. Part of it was something harder to name, a kind of test I wasn't proud of setting, but set anyway. I wanted to know if what we had was real before I complicated it with that information. We got married 18 months after we met. I wore a navy suit. She wore a cream-colored dress that her daughter helped her pick out. We had dinner at a restaurant in Asheville and went back to the small house I owned outright in the same neighborhood where I'd lived for 12 years. Gerald had opinions about the neighborhood. He expressed them once, early on, and I looked at him for a long time without saying anything, and he didn't express them again out loud. By the time of that Sunday dinner, Hargrove Logistics had been publicly traded for about 4 years. Gerald had taken it public at 61, a decision that had made him and his early investors very wealthy. What Gerald did not know, what nobody in his circle knew, was that one of those early investors was a Delaware-registered investment vehicle called Meridian Capital Strategies, and Meridian Capital Strategies was mine. I had taken an initial position in Hargrove about 2 years before I met Margaret, as part of a broader logistics sector play. I had analyzed Gerald's company the same way I analyzed every company I looked at, dispassionately, numerically, looking for the delta between what the market thought it was worth and what it actually was. Hargrove was undervalued, not dramatically, but consistently. I built my position slowly. Then I met Margaret, and I had a problem. I thought about unwinding the position. I genuinely considered it, but the position was significant by then, and unwinding it would have triggered reporting requirements that would have created more complications, not fewer. I consulted with my attorney and my accountant, and we agreed that the cleanest path was to maintain the position through Meridian and disclose it at a time of my choosing. I kept waiting for the right time. The right time did not arrive. Meanwhile, Gerald kept right on being Gerald. He had a nickname for me that he used at family gatherings, delivered with the particular warmth of a man who knows the word will land like a thumbtack. He called me the consultant, as in, let's ask the consultant what he thinks, as in, the consultant's truck is blocking the driveway again. He thought it was good-natured ribbing. I thought it was the kind of thing men say when they want to diminish someone and preserve deniability about having done it. He asked about my retirement plan at Thanksgiving one year, in front of Margaret's extended family, with genuine curiosity on his face. He said he hoped I had something set aside. He said it the way you'd say it to someone you were worried about. I said I had things managed. He said, good, and moved on, satisfied. Sylvia was softer about it, but arrived at the same place. She would mention, occasionally, that Margaret's ex-husband had done very well in commercial real estate. She would mention it the way people mention the weather, not as a complaint, just as a fact about the world that seemed relevant somehow. Margaret was aware of all of it. She told me once, lying in the dark, that she was sorry for how her parents were. I told her she didn't have to apologize. She said she knew, but she was going to anyway. I loved her for that. The trouble started about 6 months before that Sunday dinner. Hargrove Logistics had been struggling operationally, nothing catastrophic, but a steady erosion in margin across 3 of their eastern distribution centers, driven by a new VP of operations who had impressive credentials and genuinely bad instincts. Gerald had hired this man over the objections of 2 of his senior directors, and the results were becoming visible in the quarterly numbers. As the largest individual outside shareholder, Meridian held 38% of the outstanding shares. I had been watching this closely. I had requested a meeting with the company's investor relations office twice. Both times I received polite non-responses. The board was deferential to Gerald. Gerald believed his man was turning things around. I knew he wasn't. I had spent 30 years learning to read the specific kind of data that would tell you that, and the data was telling me clearly. Around that same time, Gerald decided that what Hargrove needed was family. He brought Margaret's younger brother, a 34-year-old named Philip, into a director-level role in business development. Philip was personable and not unintelligent, and had absolutely no relevant experience. Gerald introduced this decision to the family at Easter dinner as if he were announcing a promotion at a meritocracy, which it was not. I said nothing. I sat at the table and ate my ham and thought my thoughts. Then came August. Hargrove missed its quarterly earnings estimate by 11%. The stock dropped 14% in 2 days. The board called an emergency meeting. Gerald was furious in the way that people are furious when they've made a decision that was obviously wrong and need somewhere to put that feeling. He called me that Sunday afternoon, which surprised me. We had never spoken on the phone about anything that wasn't family logistics. "Walter," he said, "I want your honest read on something." I said, "Go ahead." He walked me through the operational situation at the Eastern distribution centers. He used the right vocabulary. He was not a stupid man, but he was describing the problem the same way his VP of operations had framed it, which was the wrong frame. He was looking at the symptom and calling it the disease. I told him what I actually thought, not all of it, but the real shape of it. He listened in a way that he had never listened to me before. Not as his daughter's husband, not as the consultant, but as someone who might know something he didn't. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's helpful. I appreciate that, Walter." He didn't ask me how I knew. He probably assumed it was generic business knowledge. It was not. The Sunday dinner that Margaret had mentioned was 3 weeks after that phone call. I drove us over in the truck. Margaret was quiet on the way, which she sometimes was, before her parents' house, storing herself up for something. The roast, the crystal, the particular smile. We sat down, and Sylvia poured the water, and Gerald stood at the end of the table and said he wanted to discuss something before they served the food. He said it in a way that meant the something had been discussed already between the 2 of them, and this was the announcing of a decision rather than a conversation. He said that he and Sylvia had been thinking about the family's future. He said that in light of recent events, the earnings miss, the stock performance, they felt it was time to make some changes at Hargrove. He said that Philip was going to step into a more significant role in operations. He said they wanted to bring the company back to its roots, which meant family leadership. Then he looked at me. He said he wanted to be straightforward. He said that in order to stabilize the company, they were looking at a rights offering, new shares, to bring in fresh capital and reduce the influence of outside institutional investors who didn't understand the company's long-term vision. He said they were hoping I would support this, that as a member of the family I would understand why it was important. I looked at him. I looked at Sylvia. I looked at Margaret, who was looking at her water glass. I said I wasn't sure I followed. I asked him to explain what he meant by outside institutional investors. He waved his hand. He said there was a position, a significant block of shares, held through a fund with no public face. They couldn't get traction with whoever was behind it. He said they tried to make contact and got nowhere. He said it was frustrating to have that much of your company controlled by someone who wouldn't even sit across a table from you. I said that did sound frustrating. He said it was. He said he hoped I'd talk to Margaret about supporting the rights offering so the family could present a unified position. The roast came. Sylvia asked Margaret about her sister. The crystal caught the light. I sat there and thought about the F-150 in the driveway with the dent I kept meaning to fix. I thought about 30 years of learning to see where systems fail. I thought about a Tuesday morning in March with a piece of toast going cold on the plate. After dinner, when Sylvia and Margaret were in the kitchen, Gerald poured us each a small whiskey and sat back in his chair and looked at me the way he always looked at me, with that particular brand of comfortable condescension that comes from a man who has decided what you are and sees no reason to revisit the question. He said, "I hope you understand this isn't personal, Walter. It's about protecting what we've built." I said I understood. He said the consultant probably saw these things all the time. He smiled when he said it. I said we probably saw more than people assumed. I called my attorney, a woman named Patricia, first thing Monday morning. I told her I was ready to make contact. She had been waiting for this call in some form for about 3 years. By Wednesday, she had sent a formal letter from Meridian Capital Strategies to the Hargrove Logistics Board of Directors. The letter introduced Meridian, outlined its current 38% ownership position, noted its concerns about the proposed rights offering and the recent operational performance, and requested a seat at the table for any board-level discussions about the company's future direction. I am told that Gerald received a copy of this letter at approximately 2 in the afternoon on a Wednesday. Margaret told me later that her father called her within the hour, incoherent in a way she had never heard from him before, asking if she knew anything about a fund called Meridian. She did not. I had not yet told her. That was my second mistake, after the first one of waiting too long in the first place. I should have told her before the letter went out. I knew that. And I did it anyway because I was not handling this as well as I believed I was. I want to be honest about that. Margaret found out on a Thursday evening, not from me, from her brother Philip, who had called her in a panic after Gerald told him what the letter said. Philip said the words 38%, and Margaret put together the math that her husband had a position that large, had held it for over a decade, and had never said one word about it. She came home from her sister's house at 9 o'clock that night and stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at me. I turned off the news. She said, "How long?" I said, 11 years. She was quiet. The refrigerator made it sound. She said, "Before we met?" I said, "Yes." She said, "And you never told me." I said, "No." I didn't try to explain it that night. I just said, "No, I hadn't, and I was sorry," and both of those things were entirely true. She went to bed before me. I sat in the living room until about 1 in the morning, thinking about the distance between being smart about something and being right about it, and how often those two things get confused. The next several weeks were the hardest of my marriage and some of the hardest of my life, and I'm not going to minimize that by glossing over it. Margaret and I had long conversations, the kind you don't fully remember because they're less like conversations and more like weather, something you just have to be inside of until it passes. She was angry and she was hurt, and both of those things were fair. I had treated a significant part of our shared life as information she didn't need to have, and the fact that I had reasons didn't make it not a choice. I told her everything, the full number, the history of how I'd built it, the specific sequence of decisions that had led to the Hargrove position existing before she and I existed. She listened to all of it without interrupting, which is one of the things I had loved about her since the beginning. When I finished, she said, "You've been sitting at my parents' dinner table for 18 years. I said, "Yes." She said, "While my father called you the consultant." I said, "Yes." She said, "And you never said anything." I said I had thought I was being patient. I said I wasn't sure anymore that patience and pride were as different as I believed. That made her laugh, which was not something I had expected. It was a small, tired laugh, but it was real. We kept talking. We kept talking for weeks. Gerald did not take the Meridian letter quietly. He called Patricia twice and was professional the first time and not the second. He called his own attorneys, who advised him, accurately, that a 38% outside shareholder had every legal right to oppose a dilative rights offering and request board representation. He called members of his board, several of whom were already privately skeptical of the rights offering plan, and became openly skeptical after Meridian's letter. The rights offering was withdrawn. The VP of Operations resigned 3 weeks later. The board, at the recommendation of a governance committee that had been dormant for 2 years and now suddenly had things to say, initiated a search for an independent CEO to manage the operational side, while Gerald remained as executive chairman. The new CEO, a woman who had spent 20 years running supply chain operations for a major retail chain, arrived in January. Within her first 90 days, she had identified and fixed the core issue at the Eastern distribution centers, the same issue I had outlined to Gerald on that phone call in August, described in almost identical terms. Gerald did not mention that to me. I did not raise it. The conversation I had been dreading, and perhaps also waiting for, happened on a Sunday in February. Gerald called and asked if we could meet. Not a dinner. Just the two of us, somewhere neutral. I said fine. We met at a diner about halfway between his house and mine, a place with fluorescent lighting and good coffee and the comfortable anonymity of a spot where neither of us would run into anyone we knew. He was already there when I arrived. He had ordered coffee. He looked, for the first time in 18 years, like a man who wasn't entirely sure what was going to happen next. He said he owed me an apology. I waited. He said he had not treated me with respect, not over the years and not at that dinner in October. He said he had made assumptions about me, about my capabilities, about what I was worth in every sense of that word, and that those assumptions had been wrong. He said he was not good at apologies, and he knew it, and he was making one anyway. I looked at him for a long time. The fluorescent light hummed above us. I told him I accepted the apology. I told him I also owed him honesty that I should have offered earlier, that I had held on to information I should have shared, and that whatever friction had existed between us over the years, I hadn't handled my part of it as well as I could have. He nodded. He didn't say I was wrong. We drank the coffee. We talked for a while about the company, just the business of it, the operational questions, the new CEO's first moves. He asked questions, and I answered them, and at no point did he call me the consultant. It was strange and not unpleasant, the way it is when a relationship shifts into a shape that should have existed years earlier. Before we left, he said something that stuck with me. He said, I spent 30 years building something and then spent the next 20 protecting it from everything, including people who might have been able to help. I said I understood that feeling. I didn't say, including your own son-in-law, who was your largest outside shareholder for 11 years, while you offered him wine and condescension at your dinner table. I thought it. Some things don't need to be said. Margaret and I drove to Asheville that spring, to the same area where we'd had dinner the night we got married. We stayed in a cabin outside of town for 4 days. We hiked a trail along the ridge that we'd been meaning to do for years and never gotten around to. It was cold in the mornings and warm by afternoon the way it gets up there in April, and the trees were just starting to come in. On the second day, sitting on the porch in the early evening, she asked me something I'd been expecting. She said, "If you could go back, would you have told me?" I thought about it. I wanted to give her an honest answer, not a good one. I said I would have told her earlier than I did. I said I would have waited until the letter went out. I said I believed I would have told her before we got married, not because I had to, but because the kind of marriage I wanted didn't have a room in it that stayed locked. She said, "But you're not sure." I said I wasn't sure. She nodded. The trees were going orange in the last light. She said, "I think I would have loved you anyway." I said I knew. I said that knowing it was part of what had made the secret possible and part of what had made it wrong. We sat there until it got dark. The stars out there away from the city lights are something to see. I'm 63 years old, and I still have moments when the sky does something to me that I don't have words for. Margaret reached over and put her hand over mine. I have spent my whole adult life understanding systems, where they hold, where they fail, what holds them together at the joints when everything else is under pressure. I've been right about this more often than not. I have made money on it. I have made money on it. I have built things because of it. What I have had to learn, and am still learning, is that the most important system I am part of is not a company or a portfolio or a structure anyone built deliberately. It is the small set of people who know me and chose me anyway. It does not respond to patience the way a market does. It does not reward the long game in the same way. It requires honesty, offered early, without waiting for the right moment, because the right moment is mostly a story we tell ourselves. I sat there on that porch, and I knew I had been lucky. Lucky in the ways that matter, not the money, though I am not ungrateful for the money, but in the way that Margaret was still sitting next to me, and still wanted to be. That is not something you can invest in. That is something you have to deserve. I've thought a lot about what Gerald said in that diner, that he'd spent 30 years building something and then spent 20 more protecting it from everything, including people who might have helped. He said it like a confession. I think it was. What I've come to understand is that how we treat people we've decided don't matter is not a small thing. It's actually the whole thing. Gerald had a system for sorting people, by income, by title, by the zip code they drove home to, and he trusted that system completely. It never occurred to him that the system was wrong, because it had always confirmed what he already believed. That's how blind spots work. They don't feel like blindness. They feel like clarity. I wasn't innocent in any of this. I want to be clear about that. I held on to information that belonged, at least in part, to my wife. I told myself I was being careful, being patient, waiting for the right moment. But patience that serves your own comfort isn't really patience. It's just avoidance with better posture. I let Margaret sit at that table for 18 years without the full picture who she'd married, and I did that because some part of me liked the control that knowledge gave me. I'm not proud of that. I think it's important to say it plainly. What the whole experience taught me, and I mean really taught me. Not in the way you learn things from books, but in the way you learn them from sitting in your living room at 1 in the morning wondering if your marriage is going to survive a choice you made 11 years ago. Is that intelligence without honesty is just a more sophisticated way of being selfish. I had spent my whole career being right about things. I was right about Gerald's company. I was right about his VP of operations. I was right about the rights offering. Being right about all of it didn't make me a good husband. Those are different skills, and for a long time I confused them. The other thing, and this one took longer to see, is that real strength is not the same as endurance. I had endured 18 years of Gerald's condescension. I had sat at his table and absorbed his particular brand of dismissal, and I had not flinched, and I had told myself that made me strong. It didn't. Enduring something you have the power to change is not strength. It's a choice, and I was making it for reasons I wasn't being honest with myself about. Margaret is the clearest-eyed person I know. She told me once, during those hard weeks, that she wasn't angry about the money. She was angry because I had made a decision about what she could handle, and I had made it without asking her. That's the thing that stayed with me. Not the number, not the years. The assumption underneath it all, that I knew better than she did what she needed to know about her own life. I'm 63 years old. I have been right about a lot of things and wrong about some that mattered more. What I know now that I didn't know at 40 is that the people who deserve your honesty most are not your adversaries. They're the ones who chose you. The ones sitting next to you on the porch when the light goes orange and the stars come out and you finally have nothing left to hide. That's worth more than 38% of anything.